The Scheldt Estuary, Netherlands, October 2, 1944, 5:47 a.m. The sound came first, not gunfire but water. Black water slapping against the hulls of assault boats, rhythmic and cold, carrying the smell of salt and industrial decay. The men of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division crouched in the pre-dawn darkness, their wool battle dress already soaked through, their hands white-knuckled around rifle stocks slick with condensation. They could see nothing. The fog was absolute, a living thing that swallowed sound and distance, turning the world into gradations of gray. Somewhere ahead lay the island of South Beveland. Somewhere beyond that, the port of Antwerp. And between here and there, 70,000 German troops dug into flooded polders, fortified villages, and concrete bunkers that had been designed to withstand naval bombardment. Lieutenant James McIntyre, 23 years old, from a fishing village in Nova Scotia, wrote in his field diary the night before, "Tomorrow we cross the water. No one is saying what we all know, that we might drown before we're shot." By November 8, when the last German position finally fell, 6,367 Canadians would be dead, wounded, or missing. And 5 million Europeans, starving in cities across the Netherlands and Belgium, would survive the winter because a port could finally receive ships. They called it the Battle of the Scheldt. History barely remembers it. The boats pushed off at 0600 hours. The engineers had spent the previous night inflating rubber assault craft in the darkness, working by touch alone because any light would draw artillery fire. Now those same engineers rowed, their paddles dipping quietly into water that was 2 degrees above freezing. No one spoke. Speech was unnecessary and dangerous. The plan was simple in the way military plans are simple when they ignore reality. Cross 3 kilometers of open water, land on a fortified shore, establish a beachhead, advance inland. Do this while laden with 60 pounds of equipment, in the dark, under fire, through water that would kill you in minutes if you fell in. The fog lifted at 0618. The German machine guns opened fire at 0619. The water around the boats erupted, not dramatically like in films, but with a kind of industrial efficiency. Fountains of white spray, neat and regular, walking across the surface toward the vulnerable rubber hulls. Men fell without sound. Others screamed. Most just held on and kept rowing because there was nothing else to do. McIntyre's boat made it to shore. 12 men had boarded. 9 climbed out onto mud so deep it pulled boots off so cold it burned. They scrambled up a dike slick with frost and found themselves facing a landscape that made no sense. Fields that were also lakes, roads that disappeared into standing water, villages perched on slight rises like medieval fortresses. This was the Scheldt, a drowned country where the Germans had opened the dikes and turned farmland into a defensive moat that stretched for miles. If you're already seeing why this battle deserves to be remembered, subscribe, because what comes next is why 5 million people owed their lives to what happened here. To understand the Scheldt, you must first understand Antwerp. On September 4, 1944, the British 11th Armoured Division had liberated the city virtually intact. The Germans retreated so quickly they didn't have time to demolish the port facilities. The docks, the cranes, the warehouses, the miles of quays that made Antwerp the 2nd largest port in Europe. It was a miracle. With Antwerp operational, the Allies could supply their advancing armies directly from ships, bypassing the devastated French railways and the overextended supply lines that stretched back to Normandy. There was one problem. Antwerp sits 80 kilometers inland at the end of the Scheldt Estuary. The estuary is a serpentine waterway flanked by low islands and flooded polders, with German artillery positioned on both banks. Every meter of the approach was covered by overlapping fields of fire. The port was intact and useless, a gift wrapped in barbed wire. Field Marshal Montgomery called it an administrative matter. General Eisenhower called it the most important issue at the moment. The Canadians who would do the actual fighting called it something unprintable. The assignment went to the 1st Canadian Army, not because they were expendable but because they were available and already positioned in the area. Lieutenant General Guy Simons, their commander, read the operational orders in his command post and understood immediately what was being asked. Clear 70,000 entrenched German troops from a landscape deliberately flooded to create maximum defensive advantage. Do it before winter made amphibious operations impossible, and do it while the rest of the Allied advance received priority for supplies, air support, and reinforcements. He wrote in his diary, "We are being asked to pay for Antwerp in blood." Very well. Someone must. The Battle of the Scheldt was actually 4 separate battles fought simultaneously across disconnected terrain. South Beveland, Walcheren Island, the Breskens Pocket, the Leopold Canal. Each presented unique horrors. At the Leopold Canal, the 4th Canadian Infantry Brigade attacked across a waterway barely 15 meters wide, bordered on the German side by a raised dike that provided perfect cover for defenders. The Canadians had to climb out of their assault boats, cross open water under fire, then scale a muddy slope while machine guns fired down at them from concrete pillboxes. They made 11 separate assault attempts over 8 days. Each time they were driven back. The casualty rate exceeded 40% in some companies. Wounded men drowned in the canal because there was no cover to retrieve them from. Stretcher bearers worked under fire until they too became casualties. Private Robert Thompson, age 19, from Winnipeg, wrote to his parents, "We go forward because to stay is to die anyway. It is not courage. It is arithmetic." On October 6, the Canadians finally broke through using a night assault with smoke grenades and flamethrowers, weapons of desperation that reflected the desperation of the situation. They established a bridgehead. Then they spent another week expanding it, fighting for individual houses and villages that had been turned into fortresses. The landscape was the enemy as much as the Germans. The polders, reclaimed land below sea level, protected by an intricate system of dikes and drainage canals, had been weaponized. The Germans had opened the sluice gates and removed the pumps. Seawater rushed in, turning fields into shallow lakes that were too deep to wade and too shallow for boats. The roads became narrow causeways flanked by water, every meter covered by pre-sighted artillery. Advancing meant moving single file along exposed dikes while mortars bracketed your position with mechanical precision. It meant watching the men ahead of you get cut down and knowing you had to keep walking because there was nowhere else to go. It meant crossing water in the darkness and not knowing if you were stepping into a drainage ditch or a shell crater until you were already underwater, your equipment pulling you down. The cold was its own casualty producer. Trench foot became epidemic. Men who'd been in the water for hours lost sensation in their feet, then their balance, then their ability to move at all. Some froze to death in their foxholes, not because of enemy action but because they were too exhausted to shiver anymore. Medical evacuation was nearly impossible. Jeep ambulances couldn't navigate the flooded terrain. Stretcher bearers had to carry wounded men for kilometers, often under fire, wading through water that turned bandages useless and made every wound an infection risk. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division reported that by mid-October, it was losing more men to exhaustion, exposure, and disease than to enemy fire. And still they advanced because Antwerp had to open, because the civilian population in liberated territories was starving, because someone had given an order and the arithmetic of war demanded compliance. On October 16, the assault on Walcheren Island began. Walcheren was the final fortress, a ring-shaped island with a depressed interior and high coastal dikes, garrisoned by German troops who'd had months to prepare their defenses. The only way to breach it was to bomb the dikes and flood the interior, turning the island into a shallow lake with only a few elevated positions remaining above water. The RAF attacked on October 3, using heavy bombers to breach the dikes at Westkapelle, Veer, and Flushing. The explosions were visible from the mainland, enormous geysers of water and debris, followed by the slow, inexorable inrush of the North Sea. Within hours, the interior of Walcheren was underwater. Civilians drowned. Farmhouses collapsed. Entire villages disappeared beneath the flood. The Germans retreated to the remaining high ground and waited. The Canadians, supported by British Royal Marine Commandos, landed on November 1. They came ashore in amphibious vehicles and assault boats, under fire from concrete bunkers armed with heavy machine guns and anti-tank weapons. The first wave suffered 30% casualties before reaching the beach. What followed was some of the most brutal close-quarters fighting of the war. The Germans, isolated and cut off, fought with the desperation of men who knew they were already dead. Every bunker had to be taken individually, often with flamethrowers and satchel charges. Every house became a fortress. Every room cost blood. Sergeant William Campbell, a 26-year-old from Toronto, wrote in a letter that would arrive after his death, "We are fighting ghosts in concrete. They do not surrender. They do not retreat. They simply wait until we come close enough to kill." If you're beginning to understand why this battle matters as much as D-Day, subscribe, because the story of why it was fought is about to become even more urgent. While the Canadians fought and died in the Scheldt, Europe was starving. The hunger winter of 1944-45 would kill more than 20,000 Dutch civilians. In the occupied Netherlands, food supplies had collapsed. The Germans, retreating across the country, had requisitioned or destroyed everything they could. The Dutch railway workers had gone on strike in September to support the Allied advance, and in retaliation the Germans had banned all food transport by rail or water. By October, cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague were consuming their emergency reserves. By November there would be nothing left. People were eating tulip bulbs. They were burning furniture for heat. Children were developing rickets and other diseases of malnutrition. Antwerp was the only solution. The port could handle the volume of shipping needed to feed millions. But Antwerp couldn't function while the Scheldt remained closed, while German artillery could still sink supply ships in the estuary. The Canadians knew this. It changed nothing tactically. You still had to cross the water, still had to climb the dike, still had to clear the bunker, but it reframed the arithmetic. They weren't dying to capture a port. They were dying so that children in Amsterdam wouldn't starve. Lieutenant McIntyre wrote in his final diary entry dated November 4th, "If someone had told me in training that I would be grateful to die for logistics, I would have laughed. Now I understand. Logistics is another word for life." He was killed the next day clearing a German strongpoint near Flushing. He was 23. The last German position on Walcheren fell on November 8, 1944. The Scheldt was finally cleared. Royal Navy minesweepers immediately began the dangerous work of removing the thousands of mines the Germans had laid across the shipping channels. It would take another 3 weeks before the first convoy could safely navigate the estuary. On November 28, the first Allied convoy arrived at Antwerp. 44 ships carrying grain, medicine, coal, and the industrial supplies needed to keep the war effort functioning. More importantly, they carried hope. Within days, food shipments were being distributed across Belgium and the liberated portions of the Netherlands. The caloric intake in Belgian cities doubled within a week. Dutch civilians, still trapped in occupied territory, would have to wait until the final German surrender in May 1945, but the infrastructure that would save them was now in place. Historians estimate that Antwerp's reopening prevented between 3 and 5 million deaths from starvation and disease across northwestern Europe during the winter of 1944-45. The exact number is unknowable. How do you count lives saved rather than lost? But the scale is undeniable. The Canadians paid for those lives with 6,367 casualties. That's approximately 1 Canadian casualty for every 800 European civilians who survived the winter. The arithmetic is grotesque and necessary. There were no victory parades for the Scheldt. The battle ended not with triumph but with exhaustion. Men collapsing in their positions, too tired to celebrate, too numb to process what they'd just survived. The survivors were pulled out of the line, given a few days' rest, then sent forward again because the war continued and there were never enough soldiers. The dead were buried in military cemeteries across the Netherlands and Belgium. Some in organized plots with white crosses. Others in temporary graves marked with helmets and rifles. The names were recorded meticulously because the Canadian Army, whatever its other failures, understood the importance of remembering. Sergeant Thomas Quinn, who survived the Scheldt only to be killed in Germany 3 months later, wrote to his brother, "We do not fight for glory. We fight so that others might eat breakfast without fear. If that is not remembered, then we died for nothing." The battle was barely mentioned in contemporary newspapers. The liberation of Paris, the Market Garden operation, the Battle of the Bulge, these captured headlines and imagination. The Scheldt was wet, cold, inglorious, and strategically invisible to anyone who didn't understand port logistics. Canada's official war historians would later call it one of the decisive battles of World War II in Western Europe. But decisive battles are only decisive in retrospect, and by the time historians recognized the Scheldt's importance, the veterans were old and the cultural memory had moved on. In 1948, the people of the Netherlands began a tradition that continues to this day. Every year on May 4th, during the national commemoration of the war dead, Dutch civilians place flowers at the graves of Canadian soldiers. Not just official wreaths at ceremonies, but individual flowers at individual graves. Thousands of them, placed by people who never knew the names they're honoring. In the town of Apeldoorn, a woman named Hendrika van der Kamp maintained the grave of Private David Morrison for 60 years. She never met him. He died before she was born. But her mother had survived the hunger winter, had eaten food that came through Antwerp, and had raised her children to understand that their existence was owed to strangers who fought in water and mud for a port they'd never seen. Hendrika wrote in a letter to Morrison's family in Nova Scotia, "Your son is not forgotten here. He is part of our family. We tell our children about him so that they will tell their children. This is how we repay debts that can never be repaid." The Scheldt estuary is peaceful now. The flooded polders have been drained and returned to farmland. The bunkers remain, concrete scars on the landscape, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. Tourists bicycle along the dikes where men once died in the darkness. It is beautiful in the way that all healed wounds are beautiful, the trauma invisible beneath ordinary life. But the memory persists, maintained by the Dutch with a reverence that borders on sacred duty. In Canadian military culture, the Scheldt has become a touchstone, a reminder that wars are won not just in dramatic battles but in the unglamorous, deadly work of securing supply lines and opening ports. In 2005, the Canadian government officially recognized the Battle of the Scheldt as one of Canada's most significant military achievements. Veterans, by then in their 80s, attended ceremonies in the Netherlands where thousands of Dutch citizens gathered to thank them personally. One veteran, Harold Johnson, age 84, stood at the Westkapelle monument and wept. A Dutch woman in her 60s approached him with flowers. She said simply, "My mother lived. Thank you." He nodded, unable to speak, and accepted the flowers. Later, interviewed for a documentary, he said, "We did what we were told to do. We didn't think about saving millions. We thought about the next dike, the next bunker, the next dawn. But if she says we saved her mother, then I suppose we did. I'm glad someone remembers." CDA number 3. If this forgotten battle moved you, if you believe these stories deserve to be told, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to understand that history isn't just about victories, it's about the cost of survival. The Scheldt taught a lesson that military historians still teach, that logistics is destiny, that ports matter more than territory, that the unglamorous work of supply and support determines outcomes more reliably than battlefield heroics. But it taught something else too, something harder to quantify. It taught that civilization survives because ordinary people perform extraordinary tasks when the alternative is unthinkable. Not for glory or recognition but because someone must, and they are the ones standing in the water at 0600 hours, waiting for the fog to lift. The Canadians who fought at the Scheldt were farmers and clerks, fishermen and factory workers. They became soldiers because their country asked, and they died in flooded fields because a port needed to open and children needed to eat. History forgot them quickly. The Dutch never did. The water is calm now in the Scheldt estuary. The ports function without drama. Grain ships arrive on schedule, unload, depart. No one drowns. No one freezes. The arithmetic of survival has become so routine it's invisible. But on quiet mornings, when the fog rolls in off the North Sea and turns the landscape into gradations of gray, it's possible to imagine those assault boats pushing through the darkness, the sound of water against rubber hulls, the weight of what was being asked and what was being given. 5 million people survived the winter because 6,000 fought in water and mud. The equation is simple and terrible and true. The war had taught them fear. The Scheldt taught them that some things are worth dying for even if no one remembers your name.